Welcome to Inside the Vatican, and a special welcome to our new listeners who have joined us since the conclave. My name's Colleen Dulle. I'm an associate editor at America Magazine, covering the Vatican from the US. And each week I do this podcast with our veteran Vatican correspondent, Gerard O'Connell, who calls in from Rome and has been covering the Vatican since 1985. Good morning, Jerry.
Good afternoon from Rome, Colleen. It's a cloudy day in Rome. The sunshine seems to have vanished for the moment.
Still hot as it was during the conclave?
Yes, the temperature is more or less 19, 20, 22, and we have lots and lots of tourists and pilgrims. Many, many.
I believe that. All right, so for our new listeners, this is a weekly show. We usually release it on Thursdays, and on the show, we dig into the biggest Vatican stories of the week. So, our idea is to take you kind of behind the headlines for some news and analysis from different perspectives, obviously, from me and Jerry. And also, we occasionally do these special documentary style deep dive episodes. So, you'll hear more of those coming in the coming months, but those are really special, so we'll be sure to point them out when they're coming in your podcast feed. All right. So let's get into our show. Jerry, to begin with, we're at a very unique moment, the beginning of a papacy. And I think the key question for us this week is what is the opening message of this papacy? So, Pope Leo XIV met with US Vice President J.D. Vance yesterday. This was part of a slate of meetings with heads of state and other delegations that were in Rome for the inauguration of the Pope's ministry. Jerry, what do we know about that meeting with J.D. Vance and what they discussed?
Well, it seems to have been a very cordial meeting. Of course, it's much easier than in previous pontiffs' encounters with heads of state because they both spoke English. They didn't need an interpreter, so the two of them were there by themselves, sitting across the table, the desk, in the Pope's library. And the audience had different. The first thing when Vance came in, before he sat down at table, he handed Pope Leo an envelope which was open, it wasn't sealed, and said, "This is from President Trump and the First Lady inviting you to visit the United States." And so the Pope took it and he put it on the side and said, "Yes, at some point."
At some point. Okay.
Well, it's obvious he's not going to travel immediately, and so it wasn't going to be something he's going to take up tomorrow.
Mhm.
And so then they sat down, and the atmosphere was very cordial. They had already met, remember, on Sunday. They had met the first time after the Mass. The Pope met members of the 156 state delegations
Mhm.
who had attended the Mass, including the Vice President and his wife, and Marco Rubio and his wife,
Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the US.
the U.S. Secretary of State, yes. And so they'd already kind of, as it were, said hello. And that was also seemed a very relaxed encounter. So they sat, and we don't quite know how long they actually spoke together because there were different phases to the audience. We know that the total audience in which the vice president was with the Pope lasted 45 minutes.
Mhm.
The first part of it was one on one, Vance and Leo. And it would be very interesting. They haven't revealed, neither side has revealed exactly what was said in that part of the meeting. Then Marco Rubio came in, and obviously they would be, I imagine, talking more about the international questions. And then the final part, the third part of the meeting, was when they brought in the wives of uh, the vice president, the secretary of state, and the delegation. And there was an exchange of gifts. And at the exchange of gifts, the Pope gave the gift of a bronze or a piece of sculpture representing peace and said, "This is a fragile plant." And the vice president, gave him a shirt of the Chicago Bears and with Leo 14 written on it. But
Mhm.
it, Judging by the body language, the audience seems to have gone very well. There was
Mhm.
sometimes you see at the end of a papal audience, you see some tension. You can sometimes judge by the body language.
So part of why we have to read the body language here is that we've got very little information from either side about what was actually discussed. Jerry, do you have any insights onto what may have been discussed?
Well, it would seem logical that they discussed the issues that Leo, in his homily on Sunday, in the message after at the end of Mass at the Regina Caeli, he spoke about the situation, the war. He says we cannot forget the the wars, and he mentioned Gaza, the situation in Gaza, and he spoke very specifically about. He said the surviving children, families, and elderly are basically on the brink of starvation. And he said that in the presence of the president of Israel and in the presence of a Jewish delegation of 13 people. Now, I think there's few, I'm not sure there's any Western leader who would speak so publicly, so clearly in, on an occasion like that and raise this issue. And he was basically saying, the killing has got to stop. This solution, this has to be solved. Then he moved on. And he said, also in Ukraine, people are losing lives, and we have we're waiting for peace, for something. And of course, he was aware that President Trump is trying to broker a peace. And he'd already made clear that the Vatican was willing to help in any way in negotiations or any other form of assistance to bring about peace. So those two countries, the situation in the Holy Land, in Gaza especially, and the situation in Ukraine, would certainly have been on the agenda. I cannot imagine that they would not have discussed this.
Mhm.
And they probably also, I imagine, that Vice President Vance would have briefed the Pope on what President Trump is trying to do and what's happening behind the scenes.
And for those of our listeners who might be newer, might not be familiar with the Vatican's kind of diplomatic work, the Vatican has been working towards peace in Ukraine, especially for almost the full duration of this round of that war. The Pope sent Cardinal Matteo Zuppi as a peace envoy in order to try to broker a peace between Moscow and Kiev. And there is a track record in the past of the Holy See being able to negotiate between nations. We saw this with the reopening of relations between the US and Cuba. So this is not, maybe head in the clouds kind of thinking. This is something that could actually happen, although it hasn't made any progress on making peace in Ukraine that we know of so far.
Well, I think the Holy See is committed, and Leo, from the very first words he spoke, were peace. And he's kept returning to that. That's kind of a mantra of this Pope already. He keeps saying, we need peace, we've got to work for peace, we've got to overcome the polarization, the conflicts, and we're prepared as Pope and Holy See as the Vatican as Holy See to do everything we can to bring this about. And he also, when he met after Vance, he met the religious leaders, the different Christian churches and the representatives of the different religions. And he again said, repeated this. He said, "Together we can work for peace, and we try and build a more fraternal world." And I think this is going to be a constant of this papacy. You ask me what's coming through, a constant, and that will be very much in continuation with his predecessor.
Yeah, as we were talking about this, I was even thinking about that meeting between Trump and Zelensky on the sidelines of Francis's funeral.
Absolutely, and it's very interesting that in fact the funeral and now the inauguration have provided moments for encounter. Trump met Zelensky in St. Peter's Basilica before the funeral. And Vance met Zelensky after the inauguration mass
Hmm.
in the American embassy to Italy.
Again, just months after Zelensky and Vance and Trump had that shouting match in the Oval Office.
Yes. And so I think it's very interesting that the Vatican somehow is in the center of this discussion to some extent. It doesn't have military power, it doesn't have economic power, so it can't force it, but it has a moral authority and standing in the world. And the Pope is enhancing that moral authority by his very first statements and what we have heard. And it's very clear that he's going to be strong on the whole social question.
And one last thing to note on this story is that on Donald Trump's Truth Social platform, he posted yesterday, after this audience between JD Vance and Marco Rubio and the Pope. He says, "The Vatican, as represented by the Pope, has stated it would be very interested in hosting the negotiations. Let the process begin." So seems to be signaling an openness there.
Yes, and then we heard today that the Kremlin spokesman said, we're aware of this, but the venue hasn't been decided yet.
Right. So it remains to be seen what exactly this is going to look like, whether this is going to continue to progress. We'll just have to keep an eye on it. So, for our listeners, if you would like to read more about that meeting with Pope Leo and the US delegation that included JD Vance, you can find Jerry's story linked in our show notes. Pope Leo's ministry officially began when he was elected in the conclave on May 8th, but on Sunday, around 200,000 people, including many heads of state and leaders of other Christian churches and religions, came to celebrate the beginning of his papacy at his inauguration mass in St. Peter's Square. This is a really unique liturgy. We haven't seen it since 2013 when Pope Francis began his ministry as Pope. So, we're going to talk through some of the special elements of it. But first, Jerry, I wanted to ask you to paint the picture for us. You were there. What was the scene like?
So it was really uh, a festive moment. There was tremendous joy, tremendous happiness, excitement, because people had come through the sadness of Pope Francis's death. They had come through the excitement of the rapid election of a new pope, and now here was the official inauguration of his ministry, as it were, the public moment when he was formally recognized as leader of the church. The joy was anticipated in a way when he decided to come through in the Pope mobile through the crowd in the square right down the Via della Conciliazione towards Castel Sant'Angelo, way down, and back again, and waving to people. And you had here quite an energetic, uh, reasonably young man, looking very fit, and could contrast it with the last memory we had of Pope Francis going through the square.
So, this was Leo's first Pope Mobile ride. And then also,
Absolutely.
it's unusual for the Pope Mobile to go that far down the Via della Conciliazione, right?
Well, when you have the big crowds, yes, but and you had them from all nations, and you had people, many from the United States, many, and some of them were chanting USA, USA, and some were Viva el Papa, and
On our
everybody
way out of
was.
town, we met a woman who was from the south side of Chicago who had flown in the second she heard who had been elected pope.
Yeah, well, it has really triggered enormous enthusiasm across the world because they suddenly found here is a pope of two worlds, a pope of the Americas, not just an American pope, but a pope of the Americas. And among the Latinos who were here, many were there delighted. Then there was the Ukrainians. There were so many Ukrainian flags in the square, but also the flags of other nations. And there was this tremendous moment of joy, like you have a big celebration, a wedding or some very big thing in the family. This was in the church family an extraordinary celebration of joy. And he really, there were striking moments of emotion in it. When
Yeah.
Cardinal Tagle of the Philippines, who is one of the stars of the Asian cardinals, as it were, he put
And
on the
was a front
ring.
runner going into the conclave.
He was one of them, yes. And he put on the ring, the fisherman's ring on the finger of Pope Leo. And Leo then looked at it and became very emotional, almost to the point of tears. And everybody could see because we had these maxi screens as well in the square. So people
Right.
could. But it was a touching moment because when he came out on the balcony, St. Peter's balcony on the night of his election, he was silent for a few moments. You could see the emotion in his face, and here again we saw this emotion. So you felt he's a humble man. He's a very humble man, and but he was obviously taken by the understanding of the weight of the responsibility he has got.
Hmm.
I've described one where it's a mission, but it's also a cross because
Right.
of the difficulties that every pope experiences.
Yeah, he's talked about this often. It's come up in a lot of his different speeches. I remember even at that homily that he gave to the small group on his first Sunday as Pope that he celebrated down below St. Peter's Basilica, where he talked about Saint Ignatius of Antioch coming to Rome, and uh, he said, "I'll truly be a disciple of Christ once I'm devoured by the beasts that were going to kill him." And he drew this kind of parallel with himself, but also with all church leaders and said, you know, my mission is essentially to disappear, to be to give everything up for this.
Well, he has to make Christ visible, not myself. And
That's
it's
exactly what he
exactly the
said.
opposite of the political realm where the new leader tries to make himself stand above everybody else. Here is a pope saying, my mission is not to stand above everybody else, but to make Christ more visible. And
Mhm.
it resonated a lot with the crowd, and it's his personality. He's a different personality to Francis. You could see this when he went around in the jeep,
Mhm.
but he people like him. I've spoken to several people here in Rome now, and they like him. He speaks Italian. They're very happy, but they like his style,
Mhm.
low key, not seeking a prima donna role that now I'm the leader of the church of the 1.4 billion Catholics. No,
Mhm.
he's the pastor of the pastors, the shepherd of
And
the shepherds.
And Jerry, that transitions us right into talking about the symbolism of this very unique mass. So there are several kind of symbols with which the new pope is invested, and one of them is called the pallium. This is a kind of wool vestment. It's sort of a narrow like strip of fabric that has six crosses on it that's put over the pope's head, but it's wool because it's supposed to evoke the image of the good shepherd carrying the lamb on his shoulders. It's also a symbol of the ministry of St. Peter, and it includes 3 pins that symbolize the nails used in Jesus' crucifixion. So really rich in symbolism, and that's in addition to the ring of the fisherman that you just talked about Cardinal Tagle presenting. This is the ring that in past centuries was used to seal papal documents, and you'd stamp your wax seal with it. And also, it was traditionally kissed by people who met the Pope, although Pope Francis, in his unique style, did not like for people to kiss it and sometimes pulled his hand away. And then there's all of this other like amazing symbolism in this liturgy. It starts at the tomb of Saint Peter. There's a delegation of Eastern churches leaders who pray with the new pope, and then there's also this rite of obedience, they call it, when 12 different groups come up and pledge their obedience to the pope, representing different parts of the church. So, for example, there was a married couple. So just like yeah, deep emotion, deep symbolism all the way through this mass.
Yes, I think it was really touching before the mass started. In St. Peter's Basilica, the Pope went, the cardinals, 200 cardinals, lined up on either side, and he walked down the central aisle straight to the tomb of St. Peter and went down there and prayed, accompanied by the four patriarchs.
Oh
And
gosh, that setup with the 2 lines of cardinals going all the way there is what they did during the funeral with Francis's coffin.
yes, it was the same,
Oh
but
gosh.
it was very striking, and he stood there for a few minutes, just praying in silent, realizing that he is the 266th successor of the man, Peter, who was crucified only yards away from where the basilica is. And so
Right.
there was this was powerful, and people were watching it. And then he came up, and they carried the ring and the pallium were had been placed on the tomb the night before and lay there the night. And so the deacons picked them up and brought them and carried them in front of the Pope. And the cardinals went out, the deacons followed, and then the Pope followed out to the St. Peter's Square. And that was really, you saw the unity of the church, because here were cardinals from 96 countries.
Wow.
96. Never in the history of the church have we had cardinals from so many countries. If you think there's, what is it, 193 states in the United Nations,
Mhm.
member states. So you the big absentee was there was nobody from the People's Republic of China,
Mm.
neither as state delegate or as a bishop. Some had hoped that they might have, because Taiwan was represented there. They didn't obviously want to be present with Taiwan, but they could have
Mm.
sent a bishop, and they didn't. So this reflects something, and but it was very beautiful, and the singing was really heavenly, if I may use this word.
You can't beat the Sistine Chapel choir.
And
Jerry, I actually had a question on this. I mean, all the singing was in Latin, the mass was in Latin, and I've seen some people on social media trying to say, "Oh, this is such a departure from Pope Francis," but it's not, right?
no, this is tradition. It is how what happened with Pope Francis, what happened with John Paul II, John Paul I, Paul VI, John the 23rd, you name it, go back to Pius the 12th.
Mhm.
Same, except the liturgy was renewed under at the Second Vatican Council, and so it's slightly different.
Right, it's the Vatican II mass in Latin.
Yeah, and then the singing was great, and people were there was such joy. It's difficult to communicate, but there was a sense of hope. And Francis, or the mention of Francis's name in the homily, just they connected him with Francis.
Mhm.
He's taking the baton from Francis. He's continuing the race.
Yeah, Jerry, I wanted to highlight that with you because, the whole time that I was in Rome covering the conclave and everything, every time Francis was mentioned in a big, group, especially when the Pope first came out on the balcony after his election and mentioned Francis, there were these roars of applause. Same at the meeting with the journalists. It seems like Leo actually had to like get used to pausing after he mentioned Francis because he had to get used to there being all of this applause that he had to stop for. Um, but all the way through all these events, there was a real sense that a real sense of, like, mourning at the same time as joy, which is kind of a bittersweet mix of emotions, and it seemed like that was also present in this mass, right? Pope Leo said afterwards that he said he felt the spiritual presence of Francis the whole
Yes,
time.
from heaven. But there was really, I didn't feel mourning at the mass. I felt that people were happy, and they were seeing Francis being reflected in Leo. That Leo, remember, it was Francis who made Leo a bishop.
Mhm,
He sent him to Peru. It was Francis who called him back to Rome to put a missionary in head of the Vatican's department. They call it dicastery for bishops.
mhm,
And it was Francis who made him a cardinal just, listen, 2 years ago. And
mhm,
then on the almost on near his deathbed, Francis made him a member of the small group of cardinal bishops. That's the top. The cardinals are divided in three groups: bishops, priests, and deacons. And he
mhm.
put him in the. And so Francis, in a way, had almost signaled Now we're reading with hindsight, but
Yeah, of course.
it was very clear that Francis had brought him right up
Hmm.
to the
All right.
door of St. Peter's.
All right, Jerry, you mentioned that Pope Leo talked about Francis in his homily. Let's talk about that homily. So he gave the homily at the Mass. He also prayed the Regina Caeli, which is the Sunday midday prayer immediately afterwards. What were his main messages in the homily and at the Regina Caeli?
Well, I liked at the beginning of the homily because he quoted the Saint Augustine, one of the phrases I love. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts will never rest until they rest in you.
Hmm.
And that's really very beautiful. And his while Francis as Pope would often quote Saint Ignatius, Leo as Pope, the first from the Augustinian order, quotes Saint Augustine. His central message was we must be united as a family, as a Catholic family. We have to be united. We diversity. He's said several times there's plenty of room for diversity, but let's be united because we cannot speak to a divided world if we ourselves are divided.
Hmm.
And so I think this was really appreciated by people. And there's a lot of uh, coming together. I mean, you got 133 cardinals from 70 countries who hardly knew each other and who had to have name badges
Hmm.
converging on him to be leader of the church in 24 hours. This surely is the work of the Spirit of God. And many cardinals I've spoken to afterwards said, I didn't know who I was choosing when I went in. But then and he said, I felt the hand of God was at work. And I think this is very powerful. And it's kind of light years away from the political process that we're used to in the lives of every country. And so that was the unity. And then this striking line. He knows there's wars. He's mentioned them, wars, conflicts, divisions, and he said, "This is the hour for love."
Mm.
It's it's it resonated with people. They applauded. This is the hour for love because we're at a situation where families are fighting over political. You've seen it in the United States.
Oh, certainly. It's a trope,
It's,
the Thanksgiving dinner argument.
and,
Yeah.
and here he's saying, this is the hour for love, and that's what the church is about, trying to
Hmm.
build love and fraternity. So his two messages was love and unity.
One thing that stood out to me so far in his messages, uh, in addition to just the powerful content, right? And we've talked about a lot of this already in this episode. We talked about his view of the papacy as self-sacrificing, his desire for unity, but that not meaning uniformity. But the other thing that stands out to me is just that, well, a few things. One, that every time he mentions peace, he talks about justice, keeping with kind of the tradition of Leo XIII being the Catholic social teaching pope. But also that he is just a really good writer. He has these beautiful turns of phrase, which I think, in part comes from a deep appreciation of Saint Augustine, who writes so beautifully. But the phrase that he didn't use at the inauguration mass, but he's used several other times, is he talks about a disarmed and disarming love, or a disarmed and disarming peace, or a disarmed and disarming communication. And that phrase I think is going to be a key one that we hear a lot during this pontificate, in the same way that Francis had several phrases that we heard all of the time. But yeah, disarmed and disarming, coming into a situation, an encounter without your barriers up, without your weapons raised, but also in so doing, that disarms the other person, that disarms the other party. I just think it's a really beautiful approach.
Yes, and remember that this is a missionary pope. Francis brought him to head the Vatican Department for Bishops. He said, I want a missionary. to head that office.
Right, specifically
And
because of
he's
that.
and in his homily, he said, "Unity and love, this is the missionary spirit." And
Mhm,
then we at the mass was Patriarch Bartholomew, the first among equals of the leaders of the Orthodox churches in the world. And he was the first person he greeted at the end of Mass. He met some of the religious leaders. He was the first. And we know now, the patriarch said on television, was it last night, that uh, he has spoken with Leo, and they have. It's very likely that Leo will go to Nicaea in November
mhm. Speaking of our deep dive episodes,
for
we have
for
a recent deep dive on that possible trip to Nicaea, so our listeners
yes,
can find that in our show notes.
on the 30th of November, which is the feast of Saint Andrew. So it's very likely, like Pope Francis, he will be there for that feast. And so this is, and then everybody wants to invite him. But the other striking thing, I think, from certainly an American point of view, an Anglo world point of view, that the most spoken language in the world is English. And
Mhm.
here's a pope who's speaking English,
And
and he
it's so
speaks
cool to
several.
hear. It's so cool to hear the Pope speaking in your native language.
Yes, and it's among the cardinals as well. Remember at the synod, which you and Ricardo were at,
Mhm,
uh, the most spoken language at the synod was English, followed by Spanish,
mhm,
and down was then French, and then Italian. But
mhm,
the most spoken language was English. And now we have a pope who speaks English as a first language.
mhm.
And then he's made very clear to the Muslims, I want to continue the path of Francis, and to the Jews, I want to continue the relation that was opened to the Second Vatican Council. There's new relation with the Jewish people. And with the other religions, he said, we're all God's children, like Francis, we can work together for peace and for the good of humanity and the protection of the common home, the climate
Mhm.
change. And interesting that he is also very focused on artificial intelligence. The world we're living is now being defined in many ways by artificial intelligence. But he's also made very clear his commitment to the poor. He says we must listen to the poor. They are teachers in the social teaching of the church. They are not just
Yeah.
recipients.
There's a fantastic speech that we didn't get to talk about on this episode, but that I'll link to your write up of in the show notes, where Pope Leo talked in some depth about his view of kind of doctrine, the way that it develops. He says indoctrination is immoral, and then he talks about the Catholic social doctrine of the Church, and this is where he highlights that the poor are teachers of the Church's Catholic social doctrine, and that the Church has to listen to the poor. There's a lot of really, really powerful stuff in that one, so I will link to it in our show notes for our listeners. Jerry, even though this pontificate is only in its early days, we're already starting to see some evidence of who Pope Leo is, what kind of pope he's going to be, and so I'm really looking forward to covering the rest of the pontificate with you. And yeah, I hope we'll talk again next week.
Yes, I think it's going to be a very exciting time because he's. Uh, you mentioned that last talk. He spoke about the need to train people in critical thinking in a world of fake
Absolutely.
news, in a world of distortion. We have to take. I was struck by that statement, and but I think we're going to have a lot to say to our audience, to our listeners, and I'm sure they will find it inspiring also to read and listen and perhaps watch some of the videos of what he's doing.
Especially since, many times we can now hear him in our native language. All right, Jerry, I will talk to you next week. For our listeners, you can expect a new show in your podcast feed on Thursday. So this will come out on Thursday. Next week's will also come out on Thursday, and every Thursday going forward until we go on our summer hiatus in July.